and her 44-year reign became known as England's Golden Age. Yet for all her charisma and power, Queen Elizabeth I remained the Virgin Queen. She never married or produced an heir to the throne. The question is, why? It's the greatest mystery of her reign and fertile soil for speculation.
It's the kind of court that might well generate rumours. Contemporaries must have thought, well, obviously Elizabeth ought to get married, so why isn't she getting married?
The sleepy village of Bisley claims to have an answer. Located 85 miles outside of London, it hasn't changed much today. Bisley is home to Overcourt, a small hunting lodge of King Henry VIII's. One can still see the stone-walled garden where, according to legend, little Lady Elizabeth once played with a boy her age. A boy now known as the Bisley Boy. As the story goes, when she is just 10 or 11, the young princess comes to live at Overcourt for a short period of time, while her father, King Henry, is away. One day while playing, Elizabeth falls seriously ill.
Her manservant and maidservant were absolutely terrified because there was a visit of the king coming very shortly to see his daughter.
In a matter of hours, she dies.
They were extremely concerned that they might have their heads chopped off because he was rather prone to taking draconian action for people who displeased him.
The desperate servants have a stroke of genius. They'll substitute a local child for the dead princess. One who resembles her in age, hair color, and complexion. The only problem? It's a boy. But the quick-witted servants dress him as Princess Elizabeth anyhow. According to legend, the Bisley Boy was related to Henry VIII, which would have accounted for the resemblance. The story has been passed down in this village for over 400 years, and many of the locals still believe it could be true.
When you go back in history and you look at the way that she was described later on in her adult life, yeah, there does start to become some form of semblance of possibly the truth about it.
And it is rumoured that this sickly child, having spent time in the country with her bad teeth through eating sweetmeats and her poor complexion, returned to the capital with strong, healthy teeth. And a very rosy complexion and a sort of masculine build. So, if indeed a resident of Bisley did sit on the throne of England for a number of years, then we're not going to knock it, are we?
Quite appropriate, Colin.
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Very appropriate indeed.
More than appropriate, yes.
For centuries, towns near the village of Bisley celebrated May Day by dressing up a boy in the clothing of a female Tudor royal. The legend provides a nice piece of local color, but much of the story seems outlandish. For one thing, wouldn't King Henry have noticed a change in his daughter? Surprisingly, maybe not.
Elizabeth barely saw her father. The relationship wasn't bad in the sense that they had quarrels or there was tension between them, because essentially they were alienated from each other.
The deadbeat dad may never have noticed the gender switch.
Elizabeth was the forsaken child. She was someone you very rarely referred to. She was basically sort of a skeleton in the family cupboard. You know, someone to be forgotten, to be farmed out to some country house.
In fact, there was good reason to pack Elizabeth off to the country. At the time, London was in the throes of an epidemic, the sweating sickness.
Sweating sickness was particularly virulent in the 1540s and the 1550s. London was a dirty, smelly, unsavory, unhygienic place.
Once a victim was infected, the disease could kill within hours. The plagued city was not a safe place for the royal family.
Whenever there was plague in London, the royal family tried to move out because the plague was very much associated with the urban environment. So it's quite possible that Elizabeth would be taken out of London into a country house.
So the young princess may actually have stayed at Overcourt. But for most people, the idea that she died there and was replaced by a boy seems more folklore than reality. But in the late 1800s, the Bisley boy story is bolstered when the vicar of the local church makes a startling discovery. He claims he found a coffin containing a skeleton of the girl born Princess Elizabeth. It is believed that he then reburied the bones. Archaeologist Mark Horton has traveled here from Bristol to examine the coffin.
Well, so this is a coffin, all right, a stone coffin. The big question is whether it's Roman or medieval in date.
The Romans occupied Britain over 1,000 years before Queen Elizabeth was born. So if the coffin is Roman, it's almost certainly not hers. One dead giveaway of a medieval coffin would be a drain hole at the bottom.
Drain holes to let the putrefying flesh go out through the bottom. Otherwise, you tend to get gases building up, and quite often coffins could actually explode with all the bits thrown everywhere. Possibly something there, I don't know. Ah! There it is. Oh, what's that there?
Horton can now deduce the approximate date of the coffin.
The fact it's got drain holes in the bottom makes certain that it's a medieval coffin rather than, say, a Roman coffin. There were lots of Roman coffins around here, and they were much occupied by the Romans. So the fact is this is a medieval coffin, and I would judge it to date between the 13th and early 14th century.
That would be around 200 or 300 years before the young Elizabeth was said to have died at Bisley, around 1543.
It's made of...
Despite his skepticism, Horton says the age of the coffin doesn't completely rule out the possibility that Elizabeth was buried in it.
Whoever was in there would have been reusing the coffin from 200-300 years before. And if that's the case, then maybe the 16th century is a reasonable context, because at that time it was during the English Reformation, churches were being despoiled, abbeys were being dug up and being destroyed. So the likelihood is that there are quite a lot of these coffins just lying around.
If it were the case that Princess Elizabeth died here, the body would have to have been buried very quickly, and therefore the body would have been put in possibly an existing coffin.
The discovery of the coffin doesn't provide any concrete conclusions, but it certainly stokes the embers of the Bisley story. Then, in 1910, the story catches fire when the hottest author of the day gives the Bisley tale some fresh air. Author Bram Stoker gained fame when he published a classic, Dracula. 13 years later, in his new book, Famous Impostors, the popular and well-regarded author devotes an entire chapter to the Bisley story. According to Stoker, there were many clues.
There are quite sufficient indications throughout the early life of Queen Elizabeth that there was some secret which she kept religiously guarded.
What is this deep, dark secret? Stoker scrutinizes her writings and notices a drastic change in her prose, as if written by a completely different person.
Elizabeth's literary style had entirely changed. The meagre, grudging style had become elegant and even florid, afforded by the study of the Latin and French tongues.
With his many observations, Stoker never claims the story to be true, but at the same time refuses to dismiss it out of hand.
In one way, there is a duty which the reader must not shirk, if only on his own account, not to refuse to accept facts without due consideration. Wildly improbable as the Bisley story is, it is not impossible.
The book ignites a firestorm of more gossip. Much of it centers on anecdotal observations of Queen Elizabeth's masculine features. Some mention her long, thin hands. The carved marble effigy of the Queen on her coffin has extremely long fingers, as do paintings and pairs of gloves. She wore heavy layers of white makeup on her face, which some say could have been used to hide stubble. Though others say she could have been trying to hide scars from a bout of smallpox. She was famous for her high collars and ruffles around her neck. Believers in the Bisley Boy story see that as a convenient use of fashion to hide an Adam's apple. The athletic queen loved to hunt, and she was good in the saddle, able to outride all the women and many of the men in her court. Some portraits of Elizabeth at the time look very feminine, while others look more masculine. And finally, some claim Queen Elizabeth I forbade a post-mortem upon her passing, suggesting she was hiding something. Still, with all the conjecture, most experts see the story as urban legend.